Hi guys, this is Mrs. Curley and this is our last video lecture of the entire school year as we wrap up our book. This is going to be the last three chapters of the book, chapters 11 through 13. So hopefully this week you should be finishing it. Today is Tuesday and you should be reading the last chapter so that we can do one more Google Meet option for discussion. I haven't had very many people jumping in for those Google Meet times. And so I really hope this week that maybe you could try to jump in and at least join us for 15, 20 minutes as we wrap up the book. And then you should be meeting with your Lit Circle group for Lit Circle 3. I added the materials this week for you to be able to do that for your last rotation, your last job, and those are due on Friday. So technically the last day of school is next Tuesday, but the last grade I'm taking is this Friday, which is Lit Circle 2. I'm sorry, Lit Circle 3. So please make sure that you get that done. I will not take any late work after next Tuesday, which is the last day of the school year. And I'm hoping by next Tuesday to have all the grades finalized so you know what your grade is for the quarter. If you have missing assignments at this time, please check and let me know if you have turned in work. It's still very confusing and kind of like difficult logistically to be tracking down late digital work. Sometimes I get an email, sometimes I don't see an email that you've submitted assignments. So I don't have the ability to easily go back and check every single day, every single assignment for 3 class periods a day for weeks and weeks to see that you've turned in something. So sometimes if you did, it might just be sitting there and I don't go back and open the document because I don't know it's there. So if you turned in work late and you have an N, please email me and say I turned in the such and such assignment and send me a personal email so that I can go back and get that grade in the grade book for you so it doesn't turn into a permanent Z. So today, let's go ahead and wrap up our book. So again, I think it was a challenging novel. Again, it is a good book. It is a hard book with sentence structure and vocabulary, but it is, again, a good stretch book for you to see what an AP novel is going to look like. As far as maybe deeper thematic ideas about war and conflict, jealousy, envy, forgiveness, consequences to choices, etc., as well as it has, really good writing, description, sentence structure, and as a lot of you mentioned, harder and larger vocabulary words that you have to understand sort of by the context what the sentence is saying. And so it kind of was, again, a more challenging text because of that. So this week, I'm trying to have you do one sci-fi short film, which is like a 30-minute film. I'm hoping I can get a link to you that actually works because some of the YouTube film copies have been blocked. So I'll send a link and try it for Thursday, and then you'll be posting a comment about a short sci-fi film. But other than that, we're really just working on a separate piece this week with finishing chapters 11, 12, and 13, meeting with your Lit Circle group to have an online discussion, and please send me the time and the code. A lot of people are sending me an email and saying, we're meeting Thursday at 2, but I don't have a way to log in to jump into the meeting. So you need to share the login Google Meet code with me so I can actually jump in and click on it. And I've been doing that with as many groups as I can. But again, a lot of them I've been sending replies back that I don't have a login. So please make sure that you do that. And then submitting your Lit Circle 3 materials. So again, that's all you have left. I'm thinking next Tuesday, I might set up 3 different Google Meet drop-ins for each of my 3 class periods, like one for first period, one for third period, one for fourth period again, and have it just sort of be a farewell 30-minute jump in to say goodbye to everybody and be able to see as many classmates as possible. And so it'd be more like a social time to be able to just wrap up our class. So hopefully you can drop in and do that and say goodbye to everybody next week, especially those students who are changing schools and maybe not going back to Fulbright and going to Grimsley since they won't be returning to our campus. I personally will be still teaching pre-AP next year at Fulbright, and I've gotten my permanent assignment for that. So if you are still going to be at Fulbright again, I will be in the same classroom. If you are going to Grimsley, I've heard wonderful things about the new principal. We have almost half of the English department from Fulbright moving over to Grimsley. So you'll see a lot of familiar faces with some of the teaching staff as well, as our school at Fulbright is going down smaller in size again since it's been so overcrowded and some of our staff is moving over. So I'm sure you'll still have a wonderful school experience. And don't forget, you can still always email me over the summer or next year if you're at Grimsley at the same school district email address, mcurley@bentonvillek12 and .org, and I will be glad to give you teacher recommendations or help you in any way I can, even if you're not on the Fulbright campus for 8th grade. All right, so we have technically after today 2 more days of work this week, and then Friday turn in your Lit Circle materials and you are done for the summer. So I appreciate all the hard work that you have put in, and let's go ahead and jump into chapter 11. So in chapter 11, we just left Jean at Leper's house, where he had heard all about the horrific kind of psychological damage that Leper had endured by being in the war and going off to sign up for the ski patrol. Again, when he returns back to campus, Finney tells him that the doctor had seen him and that there was, again, some warning. In my book, it's page 155. He said, Stanpole said something about not falling again, but I'm very careful. And he said, of course I won't break it again. Isn't the bone supposed to be stronger when it grows together over a place where it's been broken once? So that is foreshadowing, because there is an incident later in the book that involves Finney's leg. And so we have this hint that he's not supposed to break his leg again. He's already been told he can't play sports because any further injury could be maybe threatening to even be able to walk, or maybe have a permanent limp or a permanent injury. And so we know that kind of in the back of our mind, we should be thinking that there's still danger surrounding the idea of Finney's injury. Finney in this chapter also sarcastically admits that there is a war. And he had been holding on to this idea in the previous chapters by telling everyone there was no World War II and that it was all made up by the fat old men. And of course, that is an aspect of denial, which we also saw with Ponyboy in The Outsiders, that he also wanted to deny that maybe that Johnny was dead, if you remember The Outsiders. And here also in this book, as a way to psychologically accept the fact that he can't participate in the war, Finney had been pretending that there was no war. Now, of course, because newspapers and all the media was covering it, that would not be realistic. But again, now he actually sarcastically admits it. And he says, sure, there isn't any war. It was one of the few ironic remarks Phineas ever made. And with it, he brought quietly to a close all his special inventions which had carried us through the winter. Now the facts were reestablished, and gone were all the fantasies, such as the Olympic Games for AD 1944, closed before they had ever even opened. So I have that quote again in here in the notes. And again, that kind of shows that Finney has become more realistic and he's no longer in denial about the fact that there is a real war, which also kind of is foreshadowing that he's going to have to accept the war between him and his best friend, Jean, which he's been ignoring all the time by not really wanting to understand that Jean feels this guilt and maybe even intentionally injured him. Finney's always dealt with that by denial as well, saying, no, that didn't happen. Just shut up. I don't want to hear it. And then Finney never really had a real conversation with Jean about what happened in the tree. So they've never been able to really deal with it. In this chapter also, World War II is encroaching more and more on the boys. We do have upperclassmen, for example, who are leaving campus because they're 18 and they get drafted, or they're maybe 17 and they choose to enter the war effort and enlist. So again, we remember, as I've talked about in the last section of notes, we really have multiple levels of war in this book, and war is sort of a universal idea. Again, there are thematic statements like war has consequences, or there could be many types of wars people experience, or many types of wars can be painful and result in loss. All of those are themes that result in the things that happen from this book. But we have the war with oneself, which would be like Jean with himself, Finney with himself. And then outside that circle, we have another band of war, which is the war between friends, like maybe Jean and Finney at the conflict, and then, or even Leper and Jean. Outside that, we have the big band of war, which is the world war, the societal conflict that all these boys will eventually be touched by. So Leper returns to campus in this chapter, and the chapter ends with Brinker, whom we had seen before, sort of as a military fanatic, deciding that this time it's not going to be a joke, but he's going to be conducting an official investigation into what actually happened to Finney's leg, and it's going to be held in the First Academy building. Now, if you remember back to chapter 1, the First Academy building was one of the two fearful sights that Jean had come back to see in chapter 1 as an adult 30-year-old narrator. And he had said he wanted to see the marble stairs that were in the First Academy building. He'd forgotten how hard and cold they were. The other place he had visited was the tree. So we already know what happened in the tree because that's where Finney fell, but we don't know yet whatever happens in the First Academy building. But if you remember the foreshadowing, this should hopefully be an aha moment as you're reading that maybe something's going to happen during this interrogation meeting because this building has been referenced in foreshadowing before. So now this time, the investigation's not a joke where Jean can just play it off and say exaggerated things like that he was purposely trying to kill Finney and make everybody laugh. In this case, they actually bring in Leper and they have witnesses and they want to interrogate the witnesses about what they saw in the tree. So Leper's there and he gives a testimony that he saw two shadows in the tree and that one kind of like, he says that he was there too. I'm trying to find the page. He said, I shaded my eyes just a little, and then I could see both of them clearly enough because the sun was blazing all around them. He said, that's what it was like, the two of them, as black as death, standing there with this fire burning all around them. And then he said one of them was holding onto the trunk, holding the trunk of the tree. I'll never forget that because the trunk was a huge black shape and his hand touched the black trunk, anchoring him. And he said the other was a little further out on the limb. They both moved out, and he said they began to move like an engine. The one who moved first shook the other one's balance. And he said, and again, so he tended to make it sound like it was somewhat intentional that Jean moved the limb, and the one further out on the limb, which would be Finney, fell as a result of him maybe intentionally moving the limb. So at this point, again, Finney was hearing all this because he was there as well. And it sort of seems that once there's an outside kind of unbiased witness, and it's not just Jean saying this, that Finney then has to accept the fact that maybe it was an intentional fall. So he starts storming out of the room and he starts yelling at them and again cursing and saying, you can collect every effing fact there is in the world. And he's yelling and he's on a cane. So he's very unstable, but he's trying to move quickly because he's so angry. What happens is, of course, the conflict that's been foreshadowed in the major accident is that he falls down the marble staircase. And marble is very hard. Marble can be slippery. He's using a cane. He's angry. He's trying to rush too quickly for his physical ability, and he trips. And he falls all the way down the marble staircase and lands at the bottom. And that is the end of the chapter. So another result, another casualty of this war is Finney gets injured again. In chapter 12, Dr. Stampole says that, again, what was foreshadowed in the last chapter is that Finney has another break, but he says it's a cleaner fracture, so it sounds like it's going to be okay. Jean then breaks into the hospital room to try to talk to him through a window, but Finney is very angry, starts lunging at him, saying he's going to punch him, and eventually Jean runs away. The next day, the doctor sends for Jean to come back to the hospital to bring Finney some clothes, because if you remember, they're roommates, so he'd be the natural person to go into his closet and bring him some personal items. So he goes back to the hospital with his things, and this is where they actually have what I would consider their last conversation in the whole book. It ends up being somewhat reconciliatory, where they end up kind of actually being honest about what happens. Finney listens and seems to accept Jean's apology that he was actually jealous of him and that maybe he harmed him subconsciously. Finney then tells him, I believe you. It's okay because I understand and I believe you. You've already shown me and I believe you. And that is essentially an acceptance of an apology that Jean gave and a forgiveness that he's extending him. In this chapter, they also talk realistically about why he said there was no war. And Finney admits that what he's been doing this whole time since his first injury is sending out letters to try to be accepted into an enlisting branch of service and asking different military branches, including other countries, if they would still accept him so he could serve. He desperately wants to be a part of a world war effort. He desperately wants to be patriotic and be able to serve his country. He's the kind of person that would not want to be left behind because he's always been the leader. And unfortunately, all of these branches of service have replied and said that he's not physically able because of his injury to be able to be in any war effort or to be drafted as a soldier, and he was going to be left behind. And he realizes all the other 17 and 18-year-old boys in our country would go on without him. So that was kind of, again, a devastating thing for him because Jean realizes how much loss Finney's actually had, not just to sports, but also to his ability to be patriotic, to be a part of this world war effort, to be able to serve like all the other boys can. At the end of the chapter, there's kind of a turn of events, which was foreshadowed, but it was kind of unexpected, that Dr. Stampole comes and finds the boys and says, I think I've just seen something of boys of your generation are going to see a lot of, and I'm going to have to tell you about it now. Your friend is dead. Now, this is an unexpected death because Finney did have a cleaner break. So maybe we first thought when you read the chapter, oh, he's going to be okay after all. And then we get another twist here when he actually dies. The result is, the doctor says, in the middle, he said it was a clean break. Anyone could have said it. In the middle of it, his heart simply stopped without warning. I can't explain it. There's only one explanation. As I was moving the bone, some of the marrow must have escaped into his bloodstream and gone directly to his heart and stopped it. That's the only possible explanation. There are always risks in an operating room and war. And so we get this idea that the boys have lost several casualties of war. Leper to the actual World War II, and then Finney they've lost as a casualty of war to the war between friends, the war of rivalry. And so the author showing us that all of these types of wars are painful and can result in great loss. And as we have our adult narrator, Gene, at the end of the book, probably the greatest war he says he ever suffered through was the loss of Finney in his life. So chapter 13 is our conclusion chapter. And it's where we also go back to the adult voice of Gene as an adult. World War II is in full force now. It's actually starting to take over unoccupied classroom buildings that are in the campus because they don't have as many students now. And so they're sewing parachutes and making things for the war effort, showing that the war has actually arrived on campus. So again, I put as the 3 bulleted points right here that there are many wars in this book. There's the societal war of World War II. There's the war of man versus man with Gene and Finney, leper versus Gene, and there's also man versus self, which is Gene's own rivalry and jealousy within himself. Brinker, again, has a very military father who visits in this chapter, and you're supposed to see a juxtaposition between Brinker's dad and how he thinks war is so heroic and how the boys should want to go see fighting and get on the front lines, and because this is going to be the most important memories they make in their life. It's the most important thing they can do is serve their country and have full patriotism and risk their life, and it's going to be a rite of passage to their manhood. And he makes it seem very glamorous and exciting that they should want to see action. Gene already, though, feels that he's seen enough war action. Now, his war action that he's seen has not actually been in World War II. It's been with the war with himself and the war with his friends. And he feels he's actually killed someone already because of the loss of Finney. He has no desire at this point to prove anything to himself by going to war in World War II and becoming some sort of a hero. And he pretty much tells Brinker's dad that. Gene does end up enlisting in World War II because it's necessary that he fulfill his obligation to serve, or he would have been enlisted. But he says in this really well-known quote, "I never killed anybody," meaning in World War II, "and I never developed an intense level of hatred for the enemy because my war ended before I ever put on a school uniform. I was on active duty all my time at school. I killed my enemy there." And so that it kind of tells us that his greatest war was with himself, that he was his greatest enemy, even more than the enemies that he was told to shoot at in World War II, and that he killed the enemy, which could be Finney, but it also could be his own rivalry and his own jealousies and insecurities, that he had to kill those things during his time at Devon, and they had a great loss and impact on his life. So that's sort of what he meant by that quote. Again, he ends the book with the voice of the adult narrator who began the book, because remember, the whole book was a flashback from this 30-something-year-old who was coming back to his high school campus to reminisce about the loss and the sadness and guilt he still carried about the loss of his best friend and all the events that led up to it. And then it ends with that same adult narrator then kind of telling us that he really was not as good a person as Finney. And the very last paragraph of the book ends with, "All of them," which means all people, "except Phineas, constructed at infinite cost to themselves these Maginot Lines against this enemy they thought they saw across the frontier, this enemy who never attacked that way, if he ever attacked at all, if he was indeed the enemy." And again, what we see in that quote is the idea that people put up defenses against people they think are enemies. And he's comparing that to World War II because a Maginot Line is like a protective barrier to protect an enemy from attacking. But he's saying all people do that. We try to pretend that enemies are attacking us, but maybe they're not even attacking, and maybe there's not even an enemy, and we just think they are. And so he says the enemy may never be even attacking, if he ever attacked at all, if he was even an enemy. And by saying that, what he means is Finney was never his rival. Finney was never doing anything wrong. Finney never wanted to bring him down. He created all of this conflict in his own mind because of his jealousy and insecurity, and that there was no enemy. The only enemy that Gene had was himself. And I think that's one of our thematic ideas in the book that's really important, is sometimes we are our own worst enemy. Sometimes we are the ones that are hardest on ourselves. Sometimes we think people don't like us, and then we decide we don't like them, and they never had those feelings to start with. It's all in our head. We stereotype, we judge others, and sometimes those feelings that we put on people color and change how we see the world. And that's what Gene's saying at the end of this book. There was a war. The war was real. World War II was real. But the war with him and Finney was Gene's fault. It wasn't Finney's fault. And Finney never even knew he was in a war. Gene started it because he was jealous, and jealousy and rivalry can destroy relationships. And that's one of the main outcomes of the book. So I hope you enjoyed a separate piece as we wrapped up this week. Feel free to pop in for our discussion in the Google Meet that's announced for this week so we can wrap up any questions you have over these chapters as you're working on your Lit Circle 3 materials. And I'll talk to you soon.